Deliberate cold exposure has a very powerful effect on the release of dopamine in our brain and body. And this is one of the main reasons why people continue to do deliberate cold exposure. One of our previous guests, Dr. Anna Lembke, who's a medical doctor at Stanford University School of Medicine, she's a close colleague of mine, described the use of dopamine in her book, Dopamine Nation, an incredible book about addiction and dopamine, I should mention, and the use of dopamine elicited by cold water exposure by one of her patients. What I'm referring to is the fact that one of her patients helped themselves get and stay sober off drugs by using deliberate cold exposure to increase dopamine. So a healthier form of dopamine release than they were engaged in prior to getting sober. Now, the basis for dopamine release in response to cold exposure is that the catecholamines, norepinephrine, epinephrine, and dopamine, tend to be co-released by the same sorts of stimuli. But most stressors, and in particular things that evoke stress or are feelings of stress internally that we don't like, do not increase dopamine. They only increase norepinephrine and epinephrine. But deliberate cold exposure seems to cause a dramatic increase in dopamine, and this has actually been substantiated in a really beautiful study entitled Human Physiological Responses to Immersion into Water of Different Temperatures. Really a beautiful study. I love this study. They took people and they had them sit in chairs underwater, but their head was out, and they were immersed up to the neck in either of three different temperatures, 32 degrees Celsius, which is 89 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 degrees Celsius, which is 68 degrees Fahrenheit, or 14 degrees Celsius, which is 57.2 degrees Fahrenheit. So not super cold. But then what they did is they measured people's core body temperature throughout. They measured their metabolism, and they looked at serum levels of things like norepinephrine, epinephrine, dopamine, and cortisol. Serum meaning within the blood. So a really nice and quite thorough study. There were not a huge number of subjects in the study, but nonetheless, it was a very thorough study in terms of the number of variables that they explored. So I just want to briefly highlight some of what they saw or what they observed in this study. First of all the groups were in the water of a given temperature for 1 hour, which is much longer than most of the deliberate cold exposure protocols that anyone is using at home. So this study focused on actually somewhat moderately cool temperatures, not what I think most people would consider very, very cold temperatures, but extended the duration for quite a while. So again, 32 degrees Celsius, 20 degrees Celsius, or 14 degrees Celsius. Here's what they observed. The group that was immersed up to the neck in 32 degrees Celsius, that is 89 degrees Fahrenheit, water did not experience a shift in metabolism, nor a significant increase in dopamine, norepinephrine, or these other catecholamines. The group that was in 20 degrees Celsius, meaning 68 degree Fahrenheit, water for an hour, experienced a 93% increase in metabolic rate, which is remarkable given that the water isn't that cold, and yet an hour is a pretty long time to be in there. The group that was at 14 degrees Celsius, meaning 57.2 degrees Fahrenheit water for an hour, experienced a 350% increase in metabolism. So huge increases in metabolism. Now, the most interesting data to me, at least in terms of mental effects of deliberate cold exposure, were that the plasma or serum levels of norepinephrine in the blood increased 530%. These are huge increases in norepinephrine. So it suggests that this is a stressful stimulus, at least neurochemically speaking, stressful, despite the fact that it's not super, super cold. Although 57.2 degrees Fahrenheit, 14 degrees Celsius is not it's not a warm environment, but it's not a ultra, ultra cold environment. But an hour is a very long time to be in there. The subjects also experienced a 250% increase in dopamine concentrations, which, while not 530% as it was with norepinephrine, is still a very large increase in baseline levels of dopamine. And what was interesting is that those increases in dopamine persisted for a very long period of time afterwards, even out to 2 hours. Okay, and they stopped the study after 120 minutes of getting out of the cold, but Nonetheless, these increases in norepinephrine are huge and long-lasting, and these increases in dopamine are very large and long-lasting. And I do believe that these documented effects in humans explain much of the enhancement of attention and of feelings of well-being and mood that people typically experience after doing deliberate cold exposure. And yet, almost everybody who does deliberate cold exposure will say, yeah, it was stressful, I didn't enjoy it, or I eventually grew to like it, but that I always feel better afterwards, and then that feeling lasts a very long period of time. And I think it's almost certain that those experiences that people report relate to these increases in dopamine, and in concert with the increases in norepinephrine also explain the other effect that's commonly reported, which is an enhancement in mental acuity and the ability to focus.